Well, welcome everyone. My name is Ellen Weiss, and I am a board member of the Fund for Investigative Journalism, and so grateful to Eric for giving us this opportunity. I was the Washington bureau chief at Scripps. Before that, I worked at NPR and have been involved in investigative reporting and podcasting and audio for a long time. I'm joined by two remarkable colleagues of mine, Mark Greenblatt, who is a senior national investigative reporter at Scripps and a convert to multi-platform investigative reporting, which we'll talk a little bit about. And then Suzanne Reber, who has an incredible career in investigative reporting and audio, starting at the CBC, coming to NPR, helping to launch Reveal at CIR, and then coming to Scripps to lead podcasts there. We're gonna take questions at the end, so you might want to write them down and hold them, but we promise we'll save time for questions at the end. I'm gonna share my deck in a minute. Again, I just want to thank FIJ and also make sure that you know that FIJ gives out incredible grants to people just like you who are trying to maybe launch your own investigation, maybe bring your organization over the hump with just that extra bit of money that you need. And in the last few years, they've really looked to multi-platform kinds of investigations. So not just tech stories, but documentaries and audio. And so I really encourage you, if you haven't spent time on the website to see the work, to see the impact, I just really want to encourage you to do that. So I'm going to share my screen. We're going to go through some slides. Save your questions. I hope that I'll just ask for your forgiveness for any technical problems, but I hope we make a smooth ride of it. All right, so here we go. All right, and okay. So just a quick run through of what we're going to try to cover today. We can't cover everything, of course, but we want to talk a little bit about choosing your project, like what actually makes a good investigative podcast. And, they're great investigations. Not all of them necessarily translate into great podcasts. We'll talk a little bit about, how we did it. We've all come to this at different stages. We've all learned along the way. We're still learning, but we'll talk a little bit about characters, creating the narrative, editing, workflow. And then we'll try and get into a little bit of the nitty gritty, right? Like how long do these things take? Maybe even what kind of equipment do you need? What kind of staff or expertise do you need? Along the way, we're going to do, we've got kind of a couple of tip sheets that we have as slides. We're happy to translate them into documents as well, so that you'll just have some basic tips as you're thinking about whether you're new to this, whether you've done a little bit of it, whether you're experienced. We hope that this is going to offer something. I will say there are just a ton of great reasons to get into investigative podcasts. And I just share this one slide of some of the dozens of podcasts, probably hundreds now, that have had serious impact with investigative reporting. And so it is big. It's big, it's popular, the audience loves it. So, and everybody is learning their own way, and everybody's figuring out their own way. So I want to encourage you to really think about it as an incredible platform to reach a new audience. A couple of things, just overall thoughts, and then we'll get into it a little bit. It is definitely different from whatever your native form might have been, right? It's not audio, from your TV story. It's not reading your text piece, and it's not even just a long radio piece, right? It is a different way of telling a story, right? But some of the things that the reason why these shows and other shows, are popular is because it is a compelling story, right? Where something's uncovered, something is revealed, something happens in the course of the show, right? It's character driven, right? Audio is theater of the mind, right? So you are really trying to build a relationship with the audience through the voices, through the sounds, through the storytelling, right? It kind of has to have a beginning, middle, and end. And that goes for every episode as well as for an entire show. The three of us have worked together on our show, which is called Verified, right? And we're now about to launch season 4. Each Verified in and of itself has multiple episodes, but each show is one large story, and each episode needs to be distinct in terms of how it moves that story forward, right? I like to say one of the things I found really fun is there's no rules, really. Shows can begin wherever you feel like they should best begin. There's no format that you have to, abide by. And so it took me a while, having spent most of my career in radio, to kind of throw out the rule book on format and what you can and can't do, and bring in a lot of creativity. And the other thing is, and again, I'll just say this, is it's an incredible way to reach a totally different audience. The audience that listens to your podcast may never watch your TV documentary or may never have read your piece. And so a lot of reasons to do it. I am going to start with my colleague Suzanne, and just kind of ask her the basic question, which is like, talk about, how you spot if a story is good for podcasting. Like, what do you go through?
Well, I mean, I want to pick up on what you said, Ellen. Hi, everybody. It's nice to see you all. I want to pick up on what you said, the theater of the mind thing. I think the way that I like to think about it is we're really taking advantage of this massive change in how audiences consume stories. And obviously, it's the streaming sort of revolution. And so, if you think sort of what is podcasting doing for the audience, it's providing them an opportunity to have a very personal experience with with the stories that they choose. And it just happens to be that one of the biggest audiences in podcasting is this kind of true crime audience. And so, what I've often talked about is if we can get some of those people who are interested in, you know, that kind of dramatic story, in terms of the stories I've worked on in my career, investigative stories are often incredibly deep. We go deep, we research for periods of time, and we actually are hunting things down. We're revealing things. We're finding things out that the public doesn't know. And so that is a perfect vehicle for investigative stories. So I just want to make my pitch for podcasting as a long form format really allows us to explore those stories that we're already often in investigations doing. So we play on that idea of revealing things, and we play with that over the episodes, and we obviously pick when we're going to reveal things. We also use this whole idea of immersive programming, so we really try to take the listener on the journey with us. And so especially in the show that we're making, Verified is very much a documentary show. Reveal was a documentary show. And the reason we chose that, it's not the easiest way to go with podcasting, but it means that you're really taking the listener to a place. You're taking them with you. You're immersing the listener in the narrative. They're getting to know the characters, because what you have to remember is just how intimate audio actually is. You know, everybody is carrying with them the device that's allowing them to hear you. They're making a very personal choice to have you right in their ear. And so it's an incredibly intimate experience. And so we try and honor that in not just in the way we do the stories we pick, and also how we edit them, because we want to remember that the audience is right there with us. And so how do we do that? I look for stories, and this is the tricky part, you know, stories that are big enough that the audience kind of wants to get in. So they might have a sort of universal entry point, like our season 2 was all about talc, baby powder, which people have used for, you know, decades. And we took them behind the scenes of how it was that a company sort of hid for 50 years that there might be questions about the safety of talcum powder. So we take the audience in on maybe a universal sort of interest, but then we use we try and lean on the stories with the biggest plot. So we like stories that have a lot of twists and turns, and obviously investigations. We often don't even know as we're going in exactly what we're going to find. And we want to remember that we want to challenge the listener. So we don't want to just lay it all out. We want them to come along. So we do actually play with the whole issue of surprising them, trying to work with them to kind of not spill all the beans. So it's very much the opposite of the inverted pyramid that we do obviously with news reporting. But these are the kinds of stories I look for. And at the heart of it all are the characters. And so I like to think of the kinds of stories that we uncover. We know we have sources. We know we have whistleblowers. We know we have people who have spent years often in these stories. And they're sharing these stories with us. And I try and sort of respect the fact that a lot of our stories are really ordinary people who are suddenly in extraordinary situations. So the characters really are at the heart of these stories. And so that would probably be one of the first things I would ask somebody. Who are the people who make this story happen as you're reporting it? So those are some of the things I look for.
Yeah, and so once you've found that perfect story, right? Like, what's next? What do you do next?
Well, one of the things that I say to reporters, even as they're thinking about it, if they even have this idea, this could be a podcast, is obviously, and Mark can talk about this a bit later, we want to have, we want to record. We want to be in these scenes that are going to be part of our story. So I look for all of the, we obviously need tape to do a podcast. And so we are going to use all kinds of different things to get the listener in. So that could be the tape with the sources, that could be the interviews, that could be the stuff that's on their phone, that could be all of the assets of a story, archival tape, music, we use it all. But in terms of how we structure it, we really try and think about the series has an arc, so it has a story arc, and then every single episode, because if you think about it, if it's a 10 episode season, like season 1 was 10 episodes, that's really 10 times 30 minutes. So you're doing a bunch of documentaries, but they all have to stick together. So we spend a lot of time storyboarding our stories, trying to think about how are we going to start and then what happens next. And we do use the devices, it's not unique to podcasting, of the screenwriter's skills of cliffhangers and moments where, the audience at the end of an episode is just compelled to listen to the next one. But at the heart of it, we use a lot of the techniques. We start often with a cold open. A cold open is sort of a mini story at the beginning of a story. We like that because it kind of intrigues the listener. They kind of think like, what is this about? I want to know. And we try not to give it all away. And often that's actually one of the discussions we have in our edits is like, are we giving away too much? And so we spend a lot of time marking up the storyboard. We use stickies, we use whiteboards. So we will actually sort of design how we think the episodes could go. Now, as you're writing and as you're then editing, of course, things can shift and you move things around. And we really care about openings. And so whether that's the opening of the whole series, whether that's the opening of an individual episode, and we care about endings because we need to get the listener to the next episode. So we do lean on some of these devices, and we talk about these kinds of things a lot. But at the heart of it is the characters in the story and how we deploy them over multiple episodes. And we've done anywhere from 10 to 6,
So I'm gonna play, this is the very opening, the first season of Verified. And I'm not going to even set it up because if you're a listener, this is how the entire show began. Whoops, give me 1 second.
Cecilia, I don't know. I think I'm having a panic attack. I wasn't so scared until now. I was just nervous, but now I'm feeling really scared. I don't know if he can come after us for revenge or something. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry to be bothering you, but I don't know who else to talk to. I'm sorry, Cecilia, if you can talk to me a little bit, okay? Bye.
That was Maria, but she wasn't always this scared. 7 years ago, she was a carefree 22-year-old on her first trip abroad to Italy. And so much has happened to her since then that it's hard to put into words, but I'm going to try. I'm your host, Natasha Del Toro. I'm an investigative journalist, and I've worked on a lot of stories about crime, corruption, and abuses of power. But when I heard this one, there was just something about it that really disturbed me. And I think the reason is because what happened to Maria and the other women that you're about to meet could have easily happened to me. It could happen to any of us. The man Maria's talking about, who she's scared will come after her for revenge, he caused a lot of suffering for a lot of women, and he did it in a very calculated way. He used online tools that the women in this story, that all of us have learned to trust, whether it's to get a ride or to find a place to stay. But what happens when that trust is broken and you become the victim of a crime? If the police won't help you, where are you supposed to turn? But this is not a story about victims. This is a story about women who fight back.
So Suzanne, talk a little bit about all the things that you were talking about before, about like story arc and things that you have to do, and kind of the tricks of the trade in that particular opening that you
Yeah,
worked on.
so what you just heard there was one of our principal characters of season one, Maria. And the reason Maria was so important is because she was this young woman who had been in Italy and was assaulted by this cop that was the sort of bad guy in the series. But she also was unique in the sense that she just basically said, "Look, we're not going to stand for this. We have to do something." And she kind of organized through basically her computer and Facebook and various other apps. She basically assembled this women from all over the world to do their sort of own investigation and figure out what had happened to them and kind of band together. So we had to be very clear about who our characters were, because of course we had 14 women that we knew about, and there might be way more who actually had gotten themselves in this situation or were victimized by this cop. And so we had to really have discussions about who are the characters we will lean on. And Maria was our principal character. There was another character called Kate, another woman she was from the US, Maria's from Portugal. And so we actually, at one point, I think we had something like 17 different options for potential openings. And in the end, we chose this voicemail. It was actually, we got permission to use it. It was a voicemail that Maria had left for Cecilia, one of our reporters, one of the reporters who helped us with this series from the Italian investigative group called IRPI. And she had left this voicemail actually very close to when the trial was about to happen. And she was so scared, and we were just struck by all these years later, after everything they had done, they had managed to get their rapist, basically into court, and they were about to face him down in court, that this visceral fear was still there. And just we felt that it spoke to us in a way that we thought would kind of let people understand just what's at stake when you take on a guy who basically assaulted many of the women in his own home. So a lot goes into those discussions. We really think about those openings. Um, and I think it's all tied together with just the importance of casting those characters because they're going to be the principal vehicle for the audience to understand what's at stake. And I think Maria was just phenomenal in that way. And, you know, when you think about it, she was only 22 when all this happened. And just the amount of resilience that these women brought to bear was what captivated us. So I think it all kind of comes together in this clip, and it doesn't even tell you why she's scared. We're going to then develop this throughout the series, and she you know she obviously played a huge role in that.
So spend just a minute talking a little bit about like what does your team look like? Like what are the roles as you're thinking about when you get started? What are the roles that people that you need someone to play? It could be that they play more than one role, but you know, let's say you're a one-person team or a two-person team. How do you think about the roles?
Right. Well, obviously, we are going to take this investigation. We work with reporters. Sometimes it's in our own team, like the one that I worked on with Mark, season 3. Sometimes it's an external team, like the IRPI reporters. And what we're really trying to do is bring this investigation to life. And so then we have to produce it. We actually have to produce the podcast. So we're going to work, generally speaking, with people who have some understanding of what it takes to do an audio of, call it an audio version of your story. And so we are going to work with a producer who is likely going to be working with the reporters. Sometimes they're doing their own recording, sometimes the producer goes along. And so they're very aware of sort of the technical side of it. And you know, we're going to be recording audio. So it's either we're going to help you record the audio, we're going to train you to record the audio, or we're going to record it. And then that producer is also going to help make all the selects, you know, go through all the tape, we transcribe, we listen for the sort of best bits, if you like, the hot tape. So we have a producer. We also generally have an editor, or sometimes even more than one editor, and their role is to really always be an advocate for the audience. And so as we're going through these scripts, we're always thinking like, how is this actually landing with the listener? We're very audience focused in our editing. And we are obviously also working with the reporters about, you know, fact checking, making sure that where our story is factual, but at the same time, it's an audio version. So we are trying to build those scenes that get the listener in and out of these various bits that we want to do. So we have the editor, and also what we use a lot. Of course, we have the beauty of also being able to score these shows. So we have a composer for Verified. We actually have a composer. She has composed our theme, and then in multiple seasons, she's composed the individual songs, and that we then use to help the story along, especially when we're narrating. Sometimes that needs a bit of help. And so, who else? Have I left anybody out? We have editing, we have production, we
No,
have
I think it's
engineering. You know, the engineer at the very end is making it essentially the final product of what you hear is the mix. And the mix is a very complicated thing, but it's actually designed to make it very enjoyable for you to listen. And so those are all the people. Some of them are in staff, some of them come in for specific projects, but those would be the key jobs. And of course, we have our host, and our host is a very important advocate for the audience as well. And we're always trying to think about what is Natasha's role in this particular episode? You know, is she actually, in some cases, she's in the interview. Sometimes she's sort of stepping back and kind of asking those questions that the audience might, and she's the only one that we sort of often breaks the fourth wall, you know. She will sort of say, what is going on here? And so we always discuss like how we're going to use all those people. And then I'm sort of the showrunner. I try and keep it all on track, and and I'm often, you know, also writing. And so it's a team. That's the important thing. It's a team, and everybody's there to try and make it better, you know, because at the end of the day, it's a pretty long process. It tends to take longer than you think.
right. I think the key thing to remember is you need somebody who knows audio. Like it's okay if you don't, somebody has to take the lead in writing. That could be the reporter, that could be the host. The reporter and the host could be the same person, but someone's going to have to tell the story. And then you need an editor, and you can grab lots of people to listen to what you put together and get feedback, but someone has to play, that role of giving you feedback. So just quick review of some of the things. If you are taking a story that you have already done and you want to turn into a podcast, like put that original story away, right? Your podcast is something different. It's a new story for a new audience. And again, the question you want to ask yourself is, what's the best way to tell this story in audio? What's the best audio story I have? And it could be very different from the story that you might have told in a different medium.
I've got one thing just to throw in,
Yeah.
because I'm going to bet that there's at least half the audience right now today that probably doesn't have an engineer, a sound engineer, or somebody able to score the music. And I don't want people to think that you have to have all of that. We're fortunate and are able to do that for this show. But I also know people in, all forms of podcast making that have done a really good job. One reporter in DC at WTOP, Meg Clorty,
Yeah.
has done, phenomenal work working with one individual, producer, photographer, audio type person. And then they have a boss that they take stuff to, and so they've got enough of this structure that you basically just have to do more jobs yourself. And if you can't score something, but you still want to have some cool audio, I'm sure there's some stuff that you can pull down.
Lots of free music libraries out there that tons of people use. You're absolutely right, Mark. You can do this with, two people. You can do this yourself with, some friends who might be able to look over your shoulder. But having somebody who knows how to edit tape ultimately is kind of sort of a must.
And to get that person who will tell you that it doesn't sound as good as you think it does, or if you're a reporter who's fallen in love with your facts. I've never done that with you too, and really is fighting for something hard. Sometimes it just is just not working, and you need somebody who's who will tell you the truth. And if you can't pay them, literally buy beer for your friends or your coworkers and say, or pizza if they don't drink, and just get them together and listen, and somebody who will tell you the truth. And that's the most important thing.
Well, you can give me the perfect segue, Mark, because you came into this world really as an incredible TV broadcast reporter. And over a series of years, I sort of co-opted you into audio. And you're kind of my poster child, for someone who has made the transition and is still speaking to me. And so, talk a little bit about what that was like. Like, what was the hardest part for you?
Well, I mean, so I came up from local television, had a bit of time at the network for a while and have been at Scripps, for almost 10 years now. And you came to me, I don't know, pretty early on, and started to encourage me to start thinking about audio and start thinking about this other environment. And it was hard. I think the hardest thing for me was I didn't know about this storytelling. I didn't know about the arc that you're talking about here. And I'd never had the chance, because where I grew up, my bosses were always telling me we want shorter and tighter, and every second matters, and so they don't have time to develop the characters. And I didn't really understand the power of what these stories could do, even in a long investigative interview that we've played out over time. And you encouraged me to dabble in it, and then we had some good stuff to share. But then my biggest frustration and what I sort of sucked at first was voicing. Like I went in there with everybody kept telling me you sound like a broadcaster, and so finding and feeling comfortable with just talking, like we're talking right now, like transitioning from I've got to voice this and voice with some authority in my, to just like talking and just like being normal, and finding an authentic voice. That took me some time to transition. And I actually had to have, there was a producer that you had in the team at the time. I still remember her, Rachel Quester. She's over at the New York Times, The Daily Show these days. But she would literally stand over my shoulder as I was voicing and say, that was too stiff. That was, and so we had literally having somebody, again, who you trust, who will tell you that you're not doing it as well as you can, and that won't make you cry while they say that is I think is important. And so that, but pounding it in and just trying it, you just get better by trying. It's like anything. It's like riding a bike. You might not get it right out of the gate, but if you keep trying it, and the beauty is in this medium, you can throw out all the edits that don't really, that aren't super jazzy.
Yeah. I think with this most recent podcast you did, I think one of the places we asked you to step out of your comfort zone was kind of talking about yourself. One of the things about podcasting is it's very intimate. It's also like people have jumped through a lot of hoops to get to you, right? They have to find your show, they have to download it, they have to remember to listen to it. So the good thing is once they're there, it's like they want to be there, but then they want something from you. And I'll let you set up this this kind of tape, because I know it was hard. And we kind of, we asked you to go someplace that I don't think everybody should go in every single story, but in this one, I think it became really part of the narrative arc.
This is sort of encapsulating a lot of what we've talked about in the first half hour of this. How do you open a show? How do you, make it interesting? How do you develop character? How do you get people to want to listen? And this is, we worked together on a story where we had been putting together some new ties with a new network of terrorists and white supremacists that are sort of networking around the world and trying to give rise to a new era of crusades. And, I'm trained as a typical and as a traditional investigative reporter. I never put myself in stories. To me, it's all about the facts, and it's all about everybody that you're reporting on, and you have a bit of a distance as much as you can from the stories. And we had never intended to start the story out this way, to start the podcast this way. We were thinking about much more traditional open for a good while as we were working on this podcast. And one day I was on a call with Suzanne and, another senior producer of the podcast, Sean Powers. And I was telling them about a connection that I was making in the reporting to this Russian terrorist who we were investigating and connecting with, and how there were some commonalities with what he wanted to bring a new rise to in the world and what my great-grandfather had run away from in Russia many years ago. And they urged me to include some of that in the podcast. And this is what it is.
It's sort of a mess, but whoops, kicking stuff around from all over.
Mark has poked around in a lot of dark places.
Oh, welcome to the unfinished basement.
But there's a story that he's been avoiding for most of his life. Something he hid away in a dusty corner of his basement. Until now.
This is where sort of my family's history lives right now. I've inherited a bunch of furniture and documents from my mom, who just very recently passed away. She had long time been the family historian who really did a lot of keeping of the secrets of the family and keeping of some of the more interesting things.
Have you looked through these things before?
I will be very honest with you. I have not looked through a lot of them in detail.
Mark pulls out a document out of a chest and he shows it to me.
This is the chest that had a bunch of the documents that are now in plastic in them for some time, but where it's a sort of a family heirloom. You can see it's been passed through many hands over the years, and I continue to keep what I think are sort of the most important documents in here.
These documents are old. It's the first time he's seen this.
this document is an original document. You can see the Russian Cyrillic on it. This is a passport of a kind, a temporary passport of a kind that was issued to my great-grandfather, who is known to us as Moses Nathan. It says,
so I'm just going to stop there because I want to make sure we get through the whole presentation. But Mark, talk a little bit about, I don't know, what it was like to kind of open yourself up in that way, to the audience.
Hard, and it got harder going with where you're going to go in the next slide, because again, where this is all leading, it's a story about
sort of a mess.
A designated Russian terrorist. There he is on the left, Stanislav Vorobyev. He's the leader of the Russian imperial movement, which is gathering the world's white nationalists for a new era of crusades. They're also picking up guns. They have a paramilitary training camp, and they train people in weapons and explosives training. This is a serious guy, he's the leader of the only actual designated white supremacist group that the U.S. has ever designated in this way. And we connected with him and did actually, a big interview with him. And I was, to be very frank, given my personal history, very nervous beyond what you would normally be when you're interviewing a terrorist. And I was also, again, I think I failed actually in the first interview because I had been trained as this straight up reporter man, and I was just getting the facts out of him. What are you up to now? What are you doing? Why do you want to do this? And, got off that first interview, and I realized that as a journalist, I had failed to ask him about, and failed to disclose my own personal history. And I failed to ask him about it. And there was a very serious moment where I had to figure out, quite frankly, there's security concerns involved in all of this. And I didn't know if, as a Jewish person, I wanted to tell the leader of the Russian imperial movement who was gathering and networking with neo-Nazis, that my family history. But after a lot of talk with my family, and really thinking about it, decided to go back to him and say, hey, Mr. Vorobyev, can we do another interview? And in that second interview, I think I learned another lesson here that, I'm not a big fan a lot of the time of people who involve themselves as major reporters who involve themselves as major characters. But if there's a reason to do it, I think what will play here, it shows that it can help with the journalism. And in this case, when I was able to decide to put the questions to Mr. Vorobyev to share with him my family story, my dad was a survivor of the Holocaust. Most of my family was killed in the Holocaust on his side. And then my mom, on her side, it was my great-grandfather that fled Russia in order to get away from people like Mr. Vorobyev. And in this moment that we'll play here, I'm letting him know about that. And I believe it led to a revelatory moment where it really lets people know journalistically what these people are about, what they want to see a new rise to. I guess we can go ahead and play it.
My great-grandfather was Jewish, and his family was made to live in a particular part of Russia. And he wasn't allowed to live where he wanted to live, or visit the parts of the country that he wanted to visit, or raise a family the way that he wanted to. And he fled the country. He left for the United States. What do you make of that?
Но не этнической. Этнических ограничений не существовало в империи.
We didn't have any ethnic limitations for Jews in the empire. We had Jews on top of the government positions.
Вплоть до там министра финансов и до премьер-министра.
Even finance minister or prime minister, but they were ethnical Jews turned Orthodox. For them, it was allowed. If a person turned into Orthodoxy, then there would be no limits for them to live where they want.
So if a Jew were to convert to Russian Orthodox, then they would not have limitations on where they lived or what they could become.
Не было в империи таких ограничений.
That's true. In the Russian Empire for Jews, there were no limitations if they converted into Orthodoxy.
But what if the Jewish person wanted to remain Jewish and practice Judaism? Then what?
А вся остальная Россия была предоставлена.
Well, then the rest of Russia was at their disposal. They could live anywhere else, but not in large cities.
So I'm just going to stop down there. Any thoughts, Mark, you want to share before we go on to the
I mean, I think as a journalist, the most important part, I certainly experienced, it landed hard to hear him say, you know, if you want to keep your religion, stay out of the big cities, stay out of the universities, like, and it turns out that he has some ideas to bring that kind of society back. You know, and he's an influential player actually on the international circuit. And so it scared me, quite frankly, that this was a moment of coming face to face, you know, with something that can be very destructive and was very destructive in my own family. But again, I just think that it's being able to allow people to hear that, to experience that sort of thing. And then because they got to know me a little bit in the front end in that basement scene.
My great grandfather.
And you can, you know, it comes along and it lands and it lets you understand not only Vorobyev as a character, but the movement that he's pushing in a more powerful way that lands than if you're just sort of reading a book report to people.
That's great. So just quickly, you know, Mark went back several times to this guy for interviews. You should plan on spending lots of time with your characters. If you can, it's not a half-hour interview. You want your audience to get to know them. You want them to be interested. You want their backstory. Mic everything, mic yourself. You have no idea what's going to end up becoming useful. There are things that, you know, you think are outtakes, but they become scenes. And the other thing that's really hard sometimes is resisting filling the silence. If you sit there and you ask somebody a question and they pause, or they pause in the middle of a thought, if you can remain quiet, they will fill that space. And sometimes you'll get your best take there. So we talked about voicing, we've talked about writing and sound. So much of investigative reporting is about documents and data. And so we're just going to try quickly give you a couple of examples because we use documents and data. You know, it's such an important source of validating the reporting of the evidence of the proof. I just finished a 10-part series earlier this year, and so much of this series relied on FBI documents that we actually had to sue the FBI for to win. It was about a very important civil rights photographer, a guy named Ernest Withers. And he was intimate in the civil rights movement for 16 years. Turns out the whole time he was an FBI informant. He was kicking back information. And we got a trove of the documents of his informant files from his handler, a guy named Bill Lawrence. So the documents had to be a character in this because Withers is dead, Lawrence is dead. We couldn't really talk to them. And so we had to cast the documents. And I'll just play you an example of sort of how we did it, and also an issue that we had to deal with having to do with the documents as well.
FBI Special Agent Bill Lawrence had been dispatched to Fayette County to help protect the voting rights of the Black residents. But he decided to make spying on the visiting college activists into one of his summer projects. And so he reached out to his favorite informant for a little help.
Memo dated 5/21/65. The writer, while interviewing Ernest C. Withers, confidential source, discussed the general racial situation in Fayette County and surrounding rural areas with him.
The writer here is Bill Lawrence.
And discussed the Bureau's internal security responsibilities and intelligence responsibilities.
Ernest told Lawrence that he was planning a trip to Fayette County on assignment for Jet Magazine, and that while he was there, he would be alert for identities of outsiders who are infiltrating. The point of all this surveillance, according to the FBI, was to monitor any potential communist influence in the movement. In one report, Lawrence warns that the left-leaning white volunteers are trying to build a cadre of young Negro teenagers in Fayette County. In another report, Lawrence writes that his informant, Ernest,
fears that many of these Negroes will get a distorted view of society and are engaging in and experiencing a socialistic-oriented beatnik type experience for which they are educationally, emotionally, and culturally ill-equipped to deal.
It's condescending and conspiratorial. Remember, all of this is about a voter registration campaign. And of course, it's impossible to know if Ernest ever actually said any of these words, or if they were put in his mouth by Bill Lawrence and written into reports like these in pursuit of the Bureau's agenda.
So just quickly, that voice was the voice throughout the podcast of the documents. And this idea of interrogating whether or not these documents were really what Withers had said, whether or not they were meant to sort of support this campaign against communists and agitators, became a really important kind of through line of interrogation and questioning as we were trying to look into, like, if he was an informant, why was he an informant? And I'm just going to go really quickly because this is our favorite example of data in sound. And Suzanne, I'm just going to do this quickly so that we can take questions. This is something that Suzanne oversaw when she was at Reveal. I think you all remember there were tons of earthquakes in Oklahoma. A lot of it had to do with fracking. And so Reveal took a decade of earthquake data in Oklahoma, ran it through a synthesizer, and then turned it into an audio experience. And it's really kind of remarkable. So I'm just going to play this for you to go to their website, actually. Okay. Let's do it. We can hear it.
This is earthquakes over time.
Right. All right. So that.
Your host, Rick Vincent, the Uhuru Maggots, and Friday nights at midnight on KPFA.
Sorry. So that that is what 10 years of earthquakes sound like in Oklahoma. I'm going to stop. We will open it up for questions. And Eric, I can't see questions, so let me just see if there's more stuff in the chat.
So Ellen, if you look across the bottom, there's two areas where people can put questions. One is in the chat and one is in the Q&A. Can you see that?
Oh, there. Okay, great. Let's see. I'm Varsha. I'm a freelance journalist in India. I focus on tribal people and their voice heard apart from the climate and the environment is my main area of reporting. Not a technical person in editing and mixing of podcasts on my Android. I need to know a technique that can help me in producing an investigative story in some easy ways. Does anybody, I'm happy to take that on, or Suzanne, I don't know if you want to take that on.
No, go for it.
Look, if you have a phone, you can record people's voices. You can actually do super simple editing on your phone. You can actually do your own voice tracking. You can do everything on your phone. And the truth is, if it's a good story, and you can tell it in an interesting way, people will listen. I always like to remind people that most of Serial, like the most popular investigative podcast ever, most of it was recorded. It was a telephone call with Adnan Syed, most of the tape. It wasn't great tape in terms of its quality, but it was a great story told. So they're really simple programs that you can download on your phone. Even I can do it, I like to say. So I do think that if you want to keep it simple, it's recording things on your phone, editing on your phone. You can mix them on your phone. You can do it. Okay, is it best to have reporter voices in a series? I've often worked on a small team, so I did the interviews and wrote the narration and would voice it too. If short, just pick the right voice. I mean,
I can jump in there. I mean, look, I think that it all comes down to what the story is. In some cases, there are obviously a lot of podcasts where the main host is also reporting. But also there's a value sometimes to having a host that isn't the reporter, because the way that the reporter then shows up as a character can often be different. So it's so dependent on the story. But doing everything is also really hard. So if you have options, at least talk them through and talk about what's the best way for the listener. And sometimes a reporter-driven narrative and who's also hosting it can be fine. In other cases, it might be better to have that sort of advocate for the audience who might, like Natasha, who is sort of also able to talk to Mark, who's the reporter. It just gives you sometimes more options than you actually think. And it certainly helps, for the audience that they're not necessarily hearing the same voice all the time. That's another thing. It's a listener experience, right?
And in the case with Natasha and I, we just ended up developing a bit of a real chemistry that was authentic, and we could, just jam about, like, Natasha, can you believe that this thing just happened? Or, hey, we're headed over to the State Department right now to interview some bigwigs over there. We could like talk about it as like just real people. And I thought, I think that it can add and supplement to the reporting in an experiential way, if you do it right.
Yeah, I was just going to say, for Ernie's Secret, the reporter who did all the investigation actually kind of became a little bit of a character, which was useful. The host could turn to him and say, can we stop down for a minute? Like, what were you thinking when you got those FBI documents? Like, how did you do that? And so it became kind of a way to break up scenes, to boil down really complex concepts, so you didn't have the host like talking and lecturing to the audience. So, it's helpful. A producer can also play that role. Like, don't be afraid to think again broadly about, how do I tell this in the most interesting way? Like, if I feel like my host is lecturing people, then let me figure out how to let them ask a question of somebody and make it more interesting. If you were an independent freelance journalist and had a story, what would you do with it? Would you produce it yourself or pitch it to platforms? Who would you pitch it to? Does Scripps take unsolicited pitches? Great question. It sort of depends on what your goals and your needs are, right? You can, podcasts take time. If you have a lot of time and you don't need to get paid, then, you may want to do it yourself. Eventually, though, you want to think about, and I didn't get to this, but really important things are like, how are you going to reach the audience, right? How are you going to market this? How are you going to promote it, right? Once you've made a show, you have to figure out how to get it out to somewhere. And so sometimes finding a partner, a distribution partner, a podcast platform, if you want to sell ads, there are really easy companies to work with who are looking for content. And they may not want to muck around with your editorial, which is, you may want as an investigative reporter, but they may be willing to host your show, which means that they're going to market it inside their platform on their other shows. They're going to market it, within their range. They're going to host it, which again, there are expenses involved in hosting it. And so I think it sort of depends on what your goals are and what your needs are. And yes, I will speak for Suzanne that I think she'd be interested in hearing pitches, and I'll make sure you'll see our last slide, which is, contact information.
Ellen, can I ask a follow-up question of you on that?
Of course.
What would you say, you mentioned some companies that are out there that will do these things for you. Who are those companies specifically,
Sure.
so people can hear that?
Okay, well, we have worked with everybody from Stitcher, who actually wanted not to be a distribution partner. They were a content producing partner, and that was great because they were really invested in it, and we got resources from them. We got, resources in the form of an editor, a mixer, an engineer, all the things that we talked about. We work with a company called AdvertiseCast. Very, very different. We give them a finished product. They sell ads. They host it on the platform. We get analytics from them, which is really great. Like, figuring out how many people are listening to your podcast can be really, really hard sometimes. So it's nice to see that. And they do marketing and promotion. So those are two very, very different examples. And there are other companies out there. And I would suggest, if you want to pitch to a company, you should have like sort of a couple slide deck to talk about what your show is, who you think your audience would be good for. And is it a one-off series or is it a recurring series? I will say it's not easy to sell something that is one-off because it's very hard to build an audience. The verified audience now has over 4 million people. That took a lot of sweat to build up over time. But once we got the initial audience, right? Every time we put something in the feed, in the verified feed, every time there's a new show, we start with an audience, which is really, really great. So it has to do with what your goals are, what your needs are, and sort of, is this something that's repeatable? Do you fund investigative work in Canada? The FIJ funds domestic stories. That doesn't mean that we don't fund people who are working elsewhere, but in a sense, it has to be relatable to the US. So for example, if you were talking about the impact of US troops in Afghanistan, but you wanted to tell that story from Afghanistan, that would probably fit our criteria. If you wanted to talk about, Afghanistan's education system, that probably wouldn't. So I would, depending on what your story is from Canada, if it has a US connection, we would probably be open to a proposal. Can you suggest some true crime podcasts that true crime lovers might not have heard of? Suzanne, do you have any? I mean, I can go through some, but
Oh no, there's just so many, but honestly, it's that's tricky. Ones that we've never heard of. Oh, honestly, you're putting me on the spot there. It's
Well,
like,
I would, for the participants, throw some in the chat.
yeah, yeah.
I'm constantly asking people, like, what are you listening to now? What do you recommend? I'm currently obsessed by Rachel Maddow's new podcast because I happen to love history podcasts, and she's got a new one out that's very relatable to today. But yeah, I think that's the best.
A recent one that I really thought was intriguing is a show that the BBC did called Tunnel 29. It was about the Cold War, and what I loved there is their principal character was a German guy, and they made a decision early on in the creative decision that they said to the audience, they heard the voice and they said, this is the character, and then they literally, as you were hearing it, they used an actor to do literally the rest of that German character's entire story, because they kept diaries. There was a lot with this individual, and it was really incredible, even though it was actually, again, like you had to do with Ernie Secret, it wasn't really the actual voice of that person, but they were able to bring alive a story that it would have been really hard to do in another medium. And you really felt like you were there in Berlin with this guy, building tunnels to get people out of
Yeah.
you know, the behind the curtain. So that was really good one. Tunnel 29. So
That's great. What do I do when government officials refuse to engage and respond to questions? Well, I wish I could say that we have a super creative solution. I think the one thing that you might have to do in a podcast is remind the audience more than once that you tried to get people to talk to you. Sometimes I've heard podcasts say like, we did it with Ernie Secret. Like from the start, we were like, he's dead. He can't respond to any of this. He died before the reporter revealed to the world that he had worked with the FBI. And so we kind of just kept reminding people like, that's a fact. And we even said, it's super frustrating. We have a ton of questions for Ernest Withers that we can't answer. So I would say, you do the same thing you do in most reporting, which is say like, we really, 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 really tried.
But you can do some, I mean, like, we did some stuff, it was several years back, but with you, Ellen, but there was, I remember when we had been asking the Pentagon and the various branches of the military for photos of sex offenders that they had convicted in military courts. And then we wanted to know like where they discharged these people, like what state did they get discharged to, and some really basic information about these guys. And so we filed like, I don't know, like 500 FOIAs, and they all came back all basically saying, no, we're not going to tell you anything. We're not going to give you the photos, sort of, go pound sand. So we did something creative through audio by having the show host basically invite me to go take a bunch of envelopes of FOIAs that were sitting on my desk unopened, because I knew that they all, after you open 100 of these, that they're going to tell me no. And so we let people hear the sound of the tearing of the envelopes, and then we would read the Go Pound Sand letters live. And it created a bit of an audio experience that allowed people to feel like they were there with you, getting told no. And I thought that there are ways you can, in some cases, produce this up to allow for that.
Michael Moore made entire movies on all the people he couldn't talk to. Like I think the question is often what the audience really cares about, that you keep asking it, and then to hear how you're getting pushed around, it actually tells the story, right? It tells the story of how they're not going to talk to you. And so I think that you make it part of the action versus just saying no comment, because it's a journey. You kept trying. And so, yeah, I think make it part of the story is what I would say.
Yeah. Did you talk to the family of Ernest Withers? We actually did. In fact, the family would not talk to the reporter, but they would talk to us in the podcast. And it was huge. They were a large part of the story, because the whole part of the tension of the story was how even years later, both people who appeared in the FBI reports, the family, members of the civil rights, everybody has very different feelings about whether he was an informant and why he was an informant, and whether or not there was harm done. And the family was incredibly generous. They took us around the museum, but it was interesting to me also that they wouldn't talk to the reporter, but they agreed to talk in the podcast. And that was very, very, very important. Eric, I don't know if I can keep on taking questions. You can tell me. I know we've gone over a little bit.
Maybe end with what are some of the apps you recommend for newbies? Just a really quick, very concrete, practical suggestion to end with.
Well, go ahead.
I just think the most important thing to remember about your phone, no matter what recorder you have, every phone has a voice recorder thing, right, built in, whether it's is actually the holding of it, because the microphone in the phone tends to be at the bottom, and I think the most important thing is just the proximity, what the actual programs are. It changes, they all have different names. It's just like thinking about your phone as a microphone, and even there's small microphones you can buy. They're very reasonable and cheap. that turn your phone into a recorder, but that actually give you that little microphone. I mean, that's the thing I would say is how you hold it really matters. So, and the editing programs, I think, are, again, there's so many out there. There's a lot of freeware. I love these little buttons at the back of the phone because they allow you to hold it and turn it without a lot of mic noise. So that's what I talk to people about if they're recording with their phone.
Great. I've just shared the screen one more time. This is all our contact information. I think we're all passionate about this medium, whether you're looking to do something with Scripps or not. You know, feel free to hit us up with questions, any follow-up. We think that this is such a great vehicle for investigative reporting. It reaches a different audience. It has an impact, and anything we can do to be helpful to spread the skills and spread the storytelling, we definitely want to be part of. So thank you all so much for participating today. And thank you so much, Mark and Suzanne.
Thank you.
Have a good afternoon, guys.
Bye.
Thanks, everybody. We'll be sending out a recording of this plus a tip sheet probably early next week. Thanks for joining us.